The dust of Redemption Gulch settled on everything, a fine red powder that coated tongues, lined throats, and painted a veneer of decay over the sun-bleached clapboard buildings. It was a town clinging to existence by the grit of its people. And today, that grit was being tested. Inside the Redemption Savings and Trust, the air was thick with the scent of old paper-oiled steel and the metallic tang of fear. Jedediah Stone stood in line, a ghost trying to blend in with the living. His shoulders, once broad enough to carry the weight of a U.S. Marshal's badge, were stooped not with age, but with the burden of a past that he had ridden 1,000 miles to escape. He kept his gaze fixed on the worn floorboards, his hat pulled low, a simple rancher come to town for supplies. That was all he was now. A father, a widower, not a lawman. Not anymore. The lazy afternoon calm shattered like cheap glass. The bat-wing doors of the bank slammed open, crashing against the interior walls. 4 men spilled into the room, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas, their hands filled with Colt revolvers. The 5th man, their leader, stepped through the splintered doorway last. He moved with a chilling predatory grace, his duster swirling around his boots like a shroud. He wore no mask. He wanted his face to be seen, to be remembered. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice was a low, gravelly drawl that cut through the sudden silence. "This is a robbery. Behave yourselves, and you might just live to see supper." Panic ignited. A woman screamed. The bank teller's hands shot into the air, his face ashen. Jedediah remained perfectly still, his body reacting with an instinct he had long tried to bury. He catalogued the threats, 4 men nervous but armed, spreading out to cover the room. The leader calm and confident, his eyes sweeping over the patrons with cold amusement. Silas Kane. Jed knew the name from old posters, the ruthless outlaw who had been carving a bloody path across the territory. Jed's hand twitched, his fingers curling instinctively, searching for the familiar weight of the Colt peacemaker that now hung on a peg by his cabin door. He was unarmed, anonymous. He had a daughter, Lily, waiting for him back at the ranch. His promise to her and to the memory of his wife was to leave this life behind. He would not intervene. He was just another victim. Kane directed his men with curt gestures. They moved efficiently, stuffing cash into canvas bags, their movements practiced and brutal. One of them shoved the bank manager toward the vault. Another stood guard by the door, his pistol waving menacingly. Then the world tilted on its axis. A young woman, a farmer's wife, by her worn dress, clutched a small purse to her chest, her knuckles white. One of Kane's men ripped it from her grasp. As it fell, its contents spilled across the floorboards. Among the few coins was a small silver locket, tarnished with age, engraved with a delicate pattern of vines. Kane's eyes, chips of blue ice, locked onto it. He bent down, not with a thief's haste, but with a strange reverence, and picked it up. He held it in his palm, his thumb tracing the engraving. It was identical. The same intricate design, the same delicate clasp. It was a perfect copy of the locket he had given his wife Eleanor on their first anniversary. The one she had been wearing the day she died. "A pretty thing," Kane murmured, his voice soft, but carrying across the terrified room. He looked at the woman. "Where did you get this?" "It was my mother's," she whimpered, tears streaming down her face. Kane's lip curled into a sneer. He snapped the chain and slipped the locket into his vest pocket. "It's mine now." Something broke inside Jedediah. The carefully constructed walls of his new life crumbled into dust. That locket was more than just silver. It was a sacred relic, a symbol of a life violently stolen from him. Seeing it in the hands of a man like Silas Kane was a profanity he could not endure. The widower vanished, and the marshal returned. He moved. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a reflex honed by years of facing down men with death in their eyes. He took 2 quick steps, his body low, and drove his shoulder into the gunman nearest him. The man grunted, caught off guard, and stumbled backward into his partner. Jed's hand shot out, grabbing the man's wrist, twisting it with brutal efficiency. Bones snapped. The revolver clattered to the floor. Jed kicked it under a desk as the second gunman brought his own pistol around. Jed didn't hesitate. He slammed the heel of his palm into the man's nose. A spray of blood erupted, and the man staggered back, stunned. The entire exchange took less than 3 seconds. The 2 remaining gunmen, shocked by the sudden violent intervention, raised their weapons. But Silas Kane was faster. He raised his own revolver, not at Jed, but at the ceiling, and fired. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space. Plaster rained down. Enough, Kane's voice cracked like a whip. His men froze. The patrons cowered. Jedediah stood over the 2 groaning men, his chest heaving, the forgotten adrenaline singing in his veins. He slowly straightened up his eyes, meeting Kane's across the room. The cold amusement was gone from the outlaw's face, replaced by a flicker of something else recognition. A predatory stillness settled over him. Well now, Kane said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his lips. It seems we have a hero in our midst. He took a step forward, his gun still leveled, his gaze unwavering. He looked Jedediah up and down, taking in the worn rancher's clothes that couldn't quite hide the coiled strength beneath. "I know you," Kane said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Jedediah Stone, the marshal who cleaned out the Cimarron Strip. I thought you were dead." Jed's blood ran cold. His anonymity, his shield was gone. "The name's just Stone," Jed said, his voice rough. "And I'm just a rancher." Kane chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "A rancher who moves like a wolf among sheep. You can't wash the blood off that easy, Marshal." He gestured with his pistol toward the door. "We'll be taking our leave. But this has been illuminating." His men scrambled to their feet, grabbing the bags of money. They backed out of the bank, their guns trained on Jed. Kane was the last to leave. He paused in the doorway, the afternoon sun silhouetting his frame. He looked directly at Jed, his eyes burning with an intensity that had nothing to do with stolen money. It was personal. Deeply personal. "This ain't over, Stone," Kane promised. "Our business is just beginning." He gave Jedediah a cold, knowing look. A look that said their meeting was no accident, that this was not a random robbery, but the first move in a game Jedediah didn't even know he was playing. Then Silas Kane was gone, leaving behind the smell of gunpowder, the echo of his threat, and the chilling certainty that the past Jedediah had tried to bury had just found his grave. The ride back to the ranch was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. The heat shimmered off the red sand, distorting the horizon, making the distant mesas tremble like apparitions. The scent of sagebrush after a rare desert rain, a smell that had once brought Jed a measure of peace, now felt like a prelude to a storm. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every gust of wind sounded like a whispered name. Eleanor. His ranch was a small, solitary pocket of life, carved out of an unforgiving wilderness. A modest cabin, a sturdy barn, and a corral holding a handful of cattle were all that stood between his family and the vast, silent emptiness. It was a fortress built not of wood and stone, but of anonymity. A fortress whose walls had just been breached. He saw Lily before she saw him. She was sitting on the top rail of the corral fence, a small, resilient figure silhouetted against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. At 10 years old, she had her mother's fiery red hair and her father's quiet intensity. She was reading a worn, dog-eared book, her small legs kicking rhythmically against the wooden slats. She was the anchor of his world, the one reason he had chosen this life of quiet desperation over a lawman's violent end. As he dismounted, the familiar creak of old leather from his saddle was a mournful sound. He saw his retired gun belt hanging from a peg just inside the cabin door, a relic of a former life. For 5 years, it had been a reminder of what he'd lost. Now it felt like a premonition of what was to come. Lily looked up, her face breaking into a radiant smile that momentarily chased the shadows from his heart. "Pa, you're back. Did you get the molasses?" He forced a smile in return, masking the turmoil raging within him. "I did, little bird, and some horehound candy too." He held out the small paper bag, and she hopped down from the fence, running to him. She hugged his leg, her small arms wrapping around him, with a trust so absolute it was terrifying. He was her protector, her entire world. A world now threatened by a man who knew his name. Later that night, long after Lily was asleep, Jedediah sat at the small kitchen table, the silence of the cabin amplifying the storm in his mind. He was haunted by the memory of Eleanor's death. It hadn't been a sickness or an accident. It had been a raid on their previous homestead, faceless men in the night fire and gun smoke, and a senseless violence that had ripped his life apart. The official report called it a botched robbery by unknown bandits. He had hunted them, but the trail went cold, leaving him with nothing but unanswered questions and a grief so profound it had hollowed him out. He had moved here to Redemption Gulch to give Lily a life free from that shadow. The town itself was a study in quiet fear. It was a place where people kept their heads down and their voices low. Silas Kane and his gang had been tightening their grip on the valley for months, not just with robberies, but with a slow, creeping campaign of intimidation. They were buying up land for pennies on the dollar from ranchers too scared to refuse their methods just this side of legal. Jed had watched it all from a distance, a silent observer. He had met the town's key figures, the aging Sheriff Brody, a good man worn down by a job too big for him. Brody carried the weight of the town's safety on his stooped shoulders, and it was clear he was losing the fight. He respected Jed's desire for privacy, but his eyes held a silent plea for help Jed had always ignored. Then there was Elias Vance, a proud, stubborn rancher whose family had worked this land for 2 generations. Vance was the heart of the resistance, what little of it there was. He was a bull of a man, with a booming voice and a refusal to be intimidated. He was organizing the other ranchers, urging them to stand together. Jed admired his courage, but saw it as folly. You couldn't fight men like Kane with courage alone. You needed a coldness, a ruthlessness to match their own. A part of himself Jed had sworn to leave behind. Tonight, the town's fear felt personal. Kane's knowing look wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. The theft of that locket wasn't a coincidence. It was a message. Kane hadn't just stumbled upon Jedediah Stone. He had come looking for him. The question that clawed at Jed's soul, keeping sleep at bay, was simple and terrifying. Why? The answer came 3 days later, carried on the wind with the smell of dust and panicked livestock. Jed was mending a fence on the north side of his property when he heard it, a low, distant rumble that grew into a thunderous roar. He climbed to the crest of a small rise and saw a brown river of horns and hides pouring across the valley floor. A cattle stampede. It was headed directly for Elias Vance's ranch. By the time Jed saddled his horse and rode toward the chaos, the damage was done. The stampede, clearly deliberate, had torn through Vance's property like a force of nature. Fences were trampled into splinters. The carefully dug irrigation ditch that fed his pastures was caved in. Worst of all, the herd had been driven straight through his main well, contaminating the water supply with mud and filth. It was a devastating blow, a message written in destruction. Jed found Vance standing amidst the wreckage, his face a mask of grim fury. A half-dozen of his ranch hands were trying to round up what was left of the scattered herd. Kane's work, Vance spat, not even looking at Jed. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. No doubt about it. He made me an offer last week. I told him where he could shove it. This is more than just intimidation. Elias Jed said, his voice low. This is a declaration of war. It's a war we're losing. Vance admitted, the fight draining from his voice. He kicked at a broken fence post. Brody won't do anything. Says he has no proof. The rest of these folks are too scared to stand with me. They think if they just hand over their deeds, Kane will leave them be. Jed knew he was right. Fear was a poison, and Redemption Gulch was dying from it. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Sheriff Brody rode out to Jed's ranch. He looked older than he had a week ago, the lines on his face etched deeper, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his helplessness. He dismounted and stood by the porch, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. "Evening, Jed." Brody Jed acknowledged, not inviting him inside. "You heard about what happened at the Vance place, I imagine." Jed nodded. Brody sighed a weary rattling sound. "Jed, I'm out of my depth. Kane's got the town in a stranglehold. These ain't just cattle rustlers. They move like ghosts. They hit Vance and were gone before anyone could even get a look at them. I don't have the men, and I sure as hell don't have the stomach for the kind of fight he's bringing." He finally looked up, his eyes pleading. "The folks in town. They're remembering who you are. They're talking about the bank." Jed's jaw tightened. "My fighting days are over, Brody. I've got a daughter to think about." He gestured toward the cabin, where a lamp cast a warm golden glow in the window. Lily was inside safe. He meant to keep it that way. "I know that," Brody said, his voice earnest. "Believe me, I do. But you're the only one who's ever stood up to him. He knows your name, Jed. That means he's not going to just leave you be. You're already in this, whether you want to be or not." Brody took a step closer, his voice dropping. "I'm not asking you to pin on a badge. But I need your help. We need your help. If you don't stop him, there won't be a town left for her to grow up in." The words struck Jed like a physical blow. He had come here to build a future for Lily, a sanctuary from the violence of his past. But Brody was right. The violence had followed him. Kane wasn't just a threat to the town. He was a threat to this home, to his daughter. By trying to remain a passive observer, he was allowing the darkness to creep closer to his own front door. His promise to Eleanor was to protect their child. Hiding was no longer protection. He looked from Brody's desperate face to the warm light of the cabin window. The choice was no longer his to make. It had been made for him the moment Silas Kane had pocketed that silver locket. "All right, Brody." Jed said the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "I'll help." Unofficially. Jedediah's first move was to walk into the Lion's Den. The saloon in Redemption Gulch was Kane's unofficial headquarters, a place where his men drank, gambled, and enforced their boss's quiet reign of terror. As Jed pushed through the swinging doors, the low murmur of conversation died. Every eye turned to him. The air grew thick with unspoken hostility. He was no longer an anonymous rancher. He was the man who had interfered at the bank. He ignored the stares and made his way to the bar. His plan was simple, listen. A lawman's greatest tool wasn't his gun, but his ears. Men with too much whiskey in them often had loose tongues. He ordered a beer he had no intention of drinking and leaned against the bar, letting his eyes adjust to the dim, smoky light. The townsfolk, however, were a wall of silence. Men who would normally nod a greeting now found the contents of their glasses fascinating. They averted their gazes, their fear a palpable thing. Jed tried to catch the eye of a shopkeeper. He knew a man named Henderson. But Henderson quickly turned his back, shrinking away. The message was clear. Talking to Jedediah Stone was dangerous. His attention shifted to a table in the corner, where 3 of Kane's men were playing cards. He recognized one of them from the bank, a big, brutish man with a freshly broken nose that was swollen and purple. The man's name was Cole. He was Kane's top enforcer, a bully who enjoyed his work. Jed picked up his untouched beer and walked over to their table. "Evening, boys." Cole looked up, his eyes narrowing into hateful slits. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. The retired marshal. You lost, old man." "Just looking for some friendly conversation." Jed set his voice level. He set his beer down on their table. "I hear there was some trouble out at the Vance place." The men exchanged smirks. "Cattle get spooked sometimes," another of the men, a wiry gunman with shifty eyes, chimed in. "Ain't our concern." "Funny," Jed said, leaning forward slightly. "They got spooked in a very specific direction. Takes skill to do that." Cole's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up, towering over Jed. He was younger, bigger, and fueled by cheap whiskey and arrogance. "You got something to say, Stone, say it. Or get the hell out of here before you get hurt." Jed didn't move. He kept his eyes locked on Cole's, his posture relaxed, disarming. "I'm just curious about your boss. A man like Silas Kane. He doesn't seem the type to get his hands dirty over a few acres of dusty ranch land. There must be something more to it." Cole's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. The question had hit a nerve. "Mr. Kane's business is his own, and you'd be smart to stay out of it." He jabbed a thick finger into Jed's chest. "That was your last warning." Jed looked down at the finger, then back up at Cole's face. "I don't take warnings from men who can't hold on to their own gun in a bank." The saloon went dead quiet. Cole's face contorted with rage. He swung a clumsy, powerful right hook aimed at Jed's head. Jed had been waiting for it. He swayed back the punch, whistling past his ear. He stepped inside Cole's reach, driving the heel of his hand up under the man's chin. Cole's head snapped back, his teeth clacking together. As the big man staggered, Jed grabbed the front of his shirt, spun him around, and slammed him face first onto the card table. Wood splintered. Cards and poker chips flew into the air. The other two men jumped to their feet, reaching for their guns. But Jed was already moving. He grabbed a whiskey bottle from the ruined table and smashed it over the head of the wiry gunman. The man collapsed in a heap. The third man managed to draw his pistol, but before he could aim, Jed kicked a chair into his knees, sending him tumbling backward. The brawl was brutal and messy. Jed was out of practice. His movements weren't as fluid as they once were, his stamina not what it used to be. He took a punch to the ribs that sent a bolt of fire through his side, and another that split his lip. But the lawman's instinct, the cold, efficient calculus of violence, was still there. He fought not with anger, but with purpose, disabling his opponents with precise, non-lethal strikes. In less than a minute, it was over. Cole and his men were groaning on the floor, beaten but alive. Jed stood in the center of the wreckage, breathing heavily, his knuckles raw, the taste of blood in his mouth. The entire saloon stared at him, a mixture of fear and awe in their eyes. He had won the fight, but he knew he had lost something more important. He hadn't learned anything new about Kane, and he had confirmed what the outlaw already suspected: Jedediah Stone was not a man to be trifled with. He had shown his hand. This proved that force alone wouldn't solve the problem. Kane was too smart for that. To beat him, Jed would have to understand him, and for that, he would need to leave the town behind and return to what he did best: tracking. Under the pale light of a crescent moon, Jedediah rode into the Badlands. The failed confrontation in the saloon had taught him a valuable lesson: Kane's secrets weren't in town. They were out here in the harsh, desolate landscape that served as his kingdom. Jed circled back to Elias Vance's ravaged ranch, picking up the trail of the stampede. He wasn't looking for hoofprints. He was looking for the tracks of the men who had driven them. His old skills, dormant for 5 years, returned to him as naturally as breathing. He found what he was looking for near a rocky outcropping and the tracks of a half-dozen shod horses moving with purpose. They had ridden hard, but carefully sticking to hardpan and stone where they could to cover their trail. But they weren't perfect. A single carelessly dropped cigar butt, a broken cinch strap, the small mistakes that always gave men away. The trail led him deep into the labyrinthine canyons of the Badlands, a place where the earth was twisted into grotesque shapes of hoodoos and spires. It was a perfect place for a hideout, easily defended and impossible to approach without being seen. For 2 days he tracked them, living off jerky and water from his canteen, sleeping in short, watchful bursts. On the third day, he found it. Tucked away in a box canyon was an abandoned silver mine, the North Star. Its structures were dilapidated, the head frame a skeletal silhouette against the sky. But fresh tracks and the distant smell of cooking smoke told him it was very much active. This was Kane's lair. He spent the rest of the day observing from a high ridge, his spyglass pressed to his eye. He counted a dozen men well armed and disciplined. They moved with the efficiency of soldiers, not common outlaws. This was a sophisticated operation. But what truly puzzled him was what they were doing. They weren't mining for silver. Instead, he saw men poring over large maps spread out on tables, while others rode out in small survey parties carrying transits and measuring chains. They weren't acting like land grabbers. They were acting like prospectors. That night, under the cover of darkness, he slipped into the camp. He moved like a shadow, his footfalls silent on the loose gravel. He crept toward the largest building, the old mine office, where a single lamp burned in the window. Through the grimy glass, he could see Kane himself standing over a large map, his brow furrowed in concentration. Jed flattened himself against the wall beside the open window, listening. Kane was speaking to Cole, his voice a low, intense rumble. "And I tell you again, the gold is a distraction." Kane said, his finger jabbing at the map. "Vance's land, the Miller parcel, all of it. They're just pieces of the puzzle. The assay reports from 40 years ago were clear, but Boss Cole's voice was laced with confusion. If there's a rich vein of gold under this whole valley, why not just file a claim? Why all this trouble?" Kane let out a short, bitter laugh. "Because a claim can be challenged. Ownership cannot. I'm not here for a piece of this valley, Cole. I'm here for what's owed. I'm taking it all back." The words sent a chill down Jed's spine. Taking it all back, Wade. This wasn't about greed. It was about something else, something older and deeper. He continued his silent reconnaissance, moving toward a small shack that appeared to be Kane's personal quarters. The door was unlocked. Slipping inside, he lit a match, the small flame casting flickering shadows. The room was sparse, a cot, a small table, a trunk. But on the table next to a half-empty bottle of whiskey lay a child's doll. It was old and worn, its yarn hair frayed, one button eye missing. It was the kind of cherished object a little girl would carry with her everywhere. It was so completely out of place in this den of thieves that Jed stared at it for a long moment. It was a clue, a crack in Kane's hardened facade, suggesting a hidden personal history tied to this land. His search was cut short by the sound of approaching footsteps. He blew out the match and melted back into the shadows just as the door creaked open. He slipped out the back window and was gone, a ghost in the night, leaving the camp as silently as he had arrived. As he rode away, Kane's words echoed in his mind. "I'm here for what's owed." The mystery of Silas Kane's motives had deepened, transforming from a simple land grab into something far more personal and unsettling. Jed now knew that to stop Kane, he had to uncover the debt the man had come to collect. The key, Jed realized, was in the mine office. The maps, the old reports, Kane had mentioned the truth was in that room. He spent the next day planning his return, studying the guards' routines, the layout of the camp, the blind spots. He would go back in. But this time, he wasn't just listening. He was searching for the root of Silas Kane's obsession. He chose the dead of night when the camp was at its quietest, and a new moon provided maximum cover. He moved through the sleeping camp with practiced ease, a wraith gliding between the buildings. The mine office was dark, the single guard posted outside, slumped in a chair, half asleep. A well-aimed pebble tossed against the far side of the building created a momentary diversion, and in that instant, Jed slipped past the guard and through the unlocked door. Inside the room smelled of stale cigar smoke and old paper. Using another match, he quickly located the large map table. The maps were not geological surveys, as he had first thought. They were old plat maps, pre-settlement charts showing original land grants and property lines, some dating back 50 years. Kane had been cross-referencing them, marking them with his own notes. One area was circled again and again in red ink. Jed's blood turned to ice when he recognized the topography. It was his own ranch. He searched the room frantically, his senses on high alert. He checked the desk drawers, the shelves, a dusty filing cabinet. Nothing. It was then that he noticed the floorboards beneath the desk were scuffed and scratched, one board slightly askew. He knelt and, using the tip of his knife, pried it up. Beneath it was a small hidden compartment. His fingers closed around a heavy oilskin-wrapped bundle. He carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a stack of letters, tied with a faded ribbon, and a single daguerreotype photograph. He struck another match. The flame illuminated the image, and the world fell away. The photograph showed a young family, a man, a woman, and two small children, standing proudly in front of a newly built cabin. The man was a younger, happier version of Silas Kane. The woman beside him was radiant, and in her arms she held a baby. Standing next to them was a little girl with bright, curious eyes, clutching a familiar-looking doll with one button eye. But it was the cabin that stole Jed's breath. He knew every notch in the logs, every stone in the chimney. It was his cabin. They were standing on his land. His hands shaking, he untied the ribbon and began to read the letters. They were written in a flowing, elegant script, chronicling years of hope turning to despair. They told the story of the Kincaid family, Silas, his wife, and their children, the original settlers of the valley. They had poured their life savings and their sweat into the land, building a home from nothing. Then the letters turned dark. They spoke of a wealthy, ruthless land baron from the east who had arrived with a team of lawyers and a fraudulent claim to their valley. The baron, using his money and influence, had systematically ruined them. He had challenged their title in a corrupt court, dammed their water supply, and finally driven them off the land they had called home. The final letters were filled with anguish. Forced into a destitute exile, the Kincaids had lost everything. Their youngest child, the little girl in the photograph, had died of fever that first winter, a death Silas squarely blamed on their poverty and the loss of their home. Jed read the name of the land baron signed with a flourish at the bottom of a cruel legal notice, and he felt a cold dread wash over him. The name was Alistair Covington, Eleanor's father. The pieces slammed together with sickening force. Silas Kane's real name was Silas Kincaid. His vendetta wasn't about gold or land, and it was about revenge. A deeply personal 40-year-old quest for retribution against the family that had destroyed his. And Jedediah Stone, the man who had married Alistair Covington's daughter, the man who now lived on the Kincaid family's stolen birthright, was the final living embodiment of that injustice. Kane didn't just want the land back. He wanted to destroy Jed's life, just as Eleanor's father had destroyed his. The bank robbery, the stolen locket, it had all been a performance, a way to draw Jed out, to make him understand the nature of the game before the final, terrible move. Kane's motivation was no longer a mystery. It was a tragedy. The ride home was a desperate, heart-pounding race against a truth Jed could no longer deny. The sun was rising, painting the eastern sky in shades of blood and fire, and every shadow seemed to mock him. He had been a pawn in Kane's cruel game from the very beginning. Now, with the truth revealed, he knew Kane would escalate. He would make it personal. He would aim for Jed's heart just as his had been broken. He spurred his horse harder, the animal's lungs heaving. The familiar sight of his small cabin on the horizon brought no relief, only a gnawing, clawing terror. He was too late. He knew it in his bones. The ranch was unnervingly silent. No smoke curled from the chimney. The cattle were gone from the corral. He leaped from his horse before it had even stopped his hand, already on the butt of his holstered Colt, the weapon he had strapped on before leaving the Badlands. He threw open the cabin door. The interior was neat, undisturbed. No signs of a struggle. A plate with the remains of breakfast sat on the table. But the silence was wrong. It was a dead, empty silence that screamed of absence. He ran to her small bedroom. The bed was made, the patchwork quilt pulled up neatly. But Lily was gone. And in the center of her pillow lay a single playing card, the King of Spades Cain's calling card. Tucked beneath it was a small folded piece of paper. Jed's hands trembled as he picked it up. The note was written in a clean, steady hand. A daughter for a daughter. Come to the old mission at dusk. Alone. The words were a blade twisting in his gut. This was Cain's justice. An eye for an eye. A life for a life. He had taken the one thing in the world that mattered to Jed. All other considerations, the town, the land, the ghosts of the past, evaporated in a white-hot flash of paternal fury. This was no longer about law or justice. It was a rescue mission. A desperate final confrontation where the only stake was his daughter's life. He looked out the window toward the jagged peaks, where the ruins of the old Spanish mission stood like a skeleton against the sky. Dusk was only a few hours away. The storm broke as Jed rode toward the mission, a furious biblical tempest that mirrored the war raging in his soul. Rain fell in blinding sheets, turning the dry earth to slick mud. Wind howled through the canyons, a mournful, ghostly cry. Lightning spiderwebbed across the black sky, each flash illuminating the skeletal ruins on the high mesa, making them look like the broken teeth of a giant skull. The environment was an extension of Cain's madness, a stage set for a tragedy. He left his horse at the base of the mesa and made the final ascent on foot, climbing the treacherous, rain-slicked rock path. The crumbling adobe walls of the mission loomed out of the darkness, a place of forgotten prayers and lingering sorrows. He moved through the broken archway of the main entrance, his revolver in his hand, his senses stretched to their limit. He found them in the heart of the ruin, the roofless nave, where the main altar once stood. Lily was there tied to a heavy wooden chair, her small face pale with terror, but her eyes defiant. She was unharmed. Cain stood beside her, a silhouette against the flashes of lightning, his duster whipping in the wind. He wasn't looking at Jed, but up at the bell tower where a single rusted bell swayed silently in the gale. Did you know they built this place to save souls? Marshal Cain's voice was unnaturally calm, carrying over the roar of the storm. A monument to a faith that died in this God-forsaken land long ago. A fitting place for endings, don't you think? He turned, and his eyes met Jed's. There was no madness in them, only a profound, bottomless grief. I don't want to just kill you, Stone. I want you to understand. I want you to feel what I felt. He began to speak, his voice a low, raw monologue of pain. He told Jed the full story, not of the land baron, but of the father, Alistair Covington. He described how Covington had laughed in his face, how he'd called them squatters on his rightful property. He spoke of the long, desperate journey after they were evicted, the nights spent shivering in the cold. He described in agonizing detail watching his daughter Sarah waste away from fever, her last words, a weak plea for the home they could never return to. Your wife, Eleanor. She was a good woman. Cain said, his voice cracking. I made sure to find that out. She never knew what her father did. He built his fortune on the graves of my family. He sent her west with a dowry of blood money, and you, a righteous lawman, built your new life on my stolen land, on the very spot where my daughter drew her first breath. He gestured to Lily. He took my future. So I took yours. A daughter for a daughter. It's the only justice this world understands. Jed took a slow step forward, his gun held steady. Let her go, Cain. This is between you and me. She's an innocent child. So was Sarah Kane, roared his composure, finally breaking. Lightning flashed, illuminating the raw agony on his face. There are no innocents in this story. It was then that a new voice cut through the storm. He's right about one thing, Kane. This ain't just between you two. High above them, perched on a crumbling ledge near the bell tower, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Sheriff Brody. He was soaked to the bone, his old shotgun held with a steadiness that belied his age. Kane stared, momentarily stunned. The town cowered. Maybe Brody called down his voice, whipped by the wind. But I'm still the law in this county. And I'm not letting another child die tonight. A tense three-way standoff locked them in place. The storm raged around them, thunder, echoing the pounding in Jed's chest. He was trapped in a moral crucible. His instincts screamed at him to put a bullet in Silas Kane, to end the threat to his daughter, to deliver the vengeance that the law never could. It would be justice. But it would also be revenge. It would make him the very thing Kane believed him to be, a man willing to sacrifice anything for his own blood. Lily was watching him, her wide, terrified eyes looking to him for guidance. If he killed Kane in cold blood, what lesson would he be teaching her? The dilemma tore him apart. He could follow the path of the vengeful father or the path of the lawman he once was. He had to choose. Kane laughed, a wild, broken sound. Look at him, Brody. The great Jedediah Stone, paralyzed. Go on, Marshal, avenge your wife's family. Become the monster. He made his mistake. He took a step toward Lily, raising his pistol. Jed didn't shoot to kill. He fired at the rusted bell, hanging precariously in the tower above Brody's ledge. The bullet struck the metal with a deafening clang that momentarily stunned everyone. The second shot severed the frayed rope holding it. The massive bronze bell, weighing hundreds of pounds, tore free and plummeted downward, crashing onto the ledge where Brody stood. The ancient stone crumbled. Brody cried out, leaping back just as the ledge collapsed. He landed hard but safe on a lower level. But the falling debris created the perfect diversion. As Kane stared up in shock, Jed lunged forward. He didn't run toward Kane. He ran toward Lily. He shoved the chair she was tied to, sending it sliding across the slick mud floor, out of the immediate line of fire. Kane spun back, firing wildly. A bullet tore through Jed's sleeve, but he didn't stop. He kicked Kane's legs out from under him, sending the outlaw crashing to the ground. The gun flew from Kane's hand. The two men fell upon each other, a desperate, brutal tangle of fists and fury, their fight a primal battle in the heart of the storm. Jed used his wits, his strength, his desperation to subdue Kane, to capture him, to choose the law over the bullet, even as every fiber of his being screamed for revenge. The fight ended as quickly as it had begun. Jed, battered but victorious, pinned a struggling Kane to the muddy ground. A moment later, Sheriff Brody was there, his shotgun leveled at the outlaw's head. The chaotic shootout was over. As if on cue, the fury of the storm began to subside. The hammering rain softened to a steady drizzle, and the relentless wind died to a whisper. Through a break in the clouds, a sliver of moonlight illuminated the scene. Jed rose, breathing heavily, and went straight to his daughter. He cut the ropes that bound her, and Lily launched herself into his arms, burying her face in his chest, her small body trembling with silent sobs. He wrapped his coat around her, holding her tight, whispering words of comfort. Headlights appeared at the base of the mesa. A town posse organized by Brody and led by a grim-faced Elias Vance had arrived. They had been wary, but Brody's quiet courage had finally emboldened them to act. They swarmed the mission, rounding up Kane's men who had been waiting nearby. They looked at Jed not with the fear of a killer, but with the profound gratitude of a town saved. They returned to Redemption Gulch as dawn broke. The townsfolk emerged from their homes, their faces showing not fear, but a newfound hope. They saw Jedediah Stone not as the fearsome gunslinger of legend, but as a father who had walked through hell to protect his child. In front of the sheriff's office, Brody took Silas Kane, now bound and defeated, from Jed. The two lawmen, one old and one retired, shared a look of mutual respect. "You made the right choice," Jed Brody said quietly. Later that day, in a simple ceremony that went largely unnoticed, Sheriff Brody took off his tarnished silver star and pinned it on the chest of his young, capable deputy. He was officially retired. A new chapter had begun for Redemption Gulch. The storm had passed, washing the town clean of its fear. Weeks later, a fragile peace had settled over the valley. Silas Kincaid was gone, turned over to a federal judge to face justice for his long list of crimes. The town, under the guidance of Elias Vance and the new sheriff, was rebuilding, its spirit renewed. Jedediah Stone made a decision that surprised everyone. He sold his ranch to Elias Vance for a fair price. He explained it simply to a confused Lily as they packed their few belongings into a wagon. "This land has too many ghosts, little bird," he told her. For them, he nodded toward the memory of the Kincaids, and for us, it's time we found a place to make our own memories. It wasn't a defeat. It was a conscious choice, an act of liberation. He was freeing them both from the haunted past that clung to that soil. On their last day before they rode out of the valley for good, he took Lily to the small, quiet hill where Eleanor was buried. A simple wooden cross marked the spot overlooking the entire valley. The afternoon sun cast a warm, golden light over the landscape. From his pocket, Jed took the silver locket. He had recovered it from Kane's possessions, its delicate vine pattern a painful reminder of all that had been lost and all that had been revealed. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He knelt and gently placed it on the wooden cross, letting it rest against the weathered wood. It was a symbolic act of letting go. He was releasing the weight of the past, the searing grief for Eleanor, the simmering anger at Kane, and the heavy burden of his wife's family secrets. He was no longer Jedediah Stone, the marshal, or the widower haunted by tragedy. He was simply a father, defined not by the ghosts behind him, but by the living, breathing daughter beside him. He stood, took Lily's hand, and they walked back to the wagon, without looking back. As they rode away toward a new unwritten future in the West, Lily looked over her shoulder one last time at the town and then turned to look forward at her father. A quiet, profound understanding passed between them. The sun was rising, silhouetting them against the vast, open horizon, a classic image of rebirth, of hope, and of a future they would build together.